You think you know what the Crusades were about? Holy wars, right? Knights in shining armor riding off to reclaim the Holy Land from infidels. That's the fairy tale they fed you in school, the sanitized version that lets you sleep peacefully at night. But tonight, while you're comfortable in your ignorance, I'm going to show you what really happened in those blood-soaked centuries between 1095 and 1291. And when I'm finished, you'll never look at religious warfare the same way again. Picture this. You're sitting in a cathedral in 1095. The stone walls echoing with the voice of Pope Urban II. The air reeks of unwashed bodies packed together like cattle, the smell of fear mixed with desperate hope. Urban isn't just calling for war. He's selling the ultimate franchise opportunity. Kill in the name of God, he whispers, and all your sins are forgiven. But here's what he doesn't mention in his recruitment speech. The church is broke, the Byzantine Empire is offering gold, and European nobles need somewhere to dump their surplus sons before they start civil wars at home. You see, the First Crusade wasn't born from divine revelation. It was born from economic desperation wrapped in religious packaging. The church had spent decades convincing people that violence was a sin, and now they needed to flip the script overnight. How do you turn farmers into killers? You tell them God wants it. Deus vult, they chanted. But what God really wanted was the church's debt problem solved. The recruitment methods would make modern cult leaders jealous. Preachers like Peter the Hermit wandered through villages, showing crowds pieces of what they claimed was Christ's cross, drops of his blood, fragments of his tomb. These relics were about as authentic as a $3 bill, but starving peasants don't fact-check miracles. They see a chance to escape their feudal hell, and they take it. The church promised not just spiritual salvation, but economic freedom. Join the crusade and your debts are forgiven. Your family gets protection. You get to keep whatever you can steal. But here's where the story gets truly disturbing. Before these holy warriors ever reached Jerusalem, they decided to practice on easier targets. Why travel thousands of miles to kill Muslims when there were perfectly good Jews living right next door? The Rhineland massacres of 1096 turned German cities into slaughterhouses. Entire Jewish communities were locked inside synagogues and burned alive. Children were thrown into rivers. Pregnant women were cut open, their unborn children torn from their wombs. The leaders knew this would happen. They planned for it. When Godfrey of Bouillon demanded tribute from Jewish communities to fund his crusade, he wasn't making idle threats. He was running a protection racket with divine approval. Pay up or face the consequences when his army of pilgrims arrived. The Jews of Mainz scraped together 500 pieces of silver, thinking it would buy them safety. Instead, it bought them a few extra days of life. Rabbi Kalonymus ben Meshulam wrote in his chronicle, "They came upon us like wolves, and we had nowhere to flee." But this wasn't random violence. This was systematic extermination disguised as religious fervor. The Crusaders had discovered something the church would never admit. Once you convince people that murder is holy, they don't stop at your intended targets. The armies that finally reached Constantinople in 1097 weren't the disciplined knights of legend. They were a plague of locusts in human form. The Byzantine Emperor Alexios had asked for maybe 10,000 professional soldiers to help reclaim some lost territory. Instead, he got 100,000 religious fanatics, who immediately started pillaging his own lands. These weren't liberators. They were an invasion force that happened to be heading in the right direction. The siege of Nicaea should have been their first wake-up call. The Crusaders spent weeks hurling diseased corpses over the city walls, turning biological warfare into a sacrament. When the city finally surrendered to the Byzantines instead of to them, the Crusaders' rage was terrifying. They had come to kill for God, and God's allies had just denied them their blood sacrifice. But nothing, absolutely nothing, prepared the world for what happened when they finally reached Jerusalem in 1099. The city that three major religions called holy became a charnel house that would make modern war criminals vomit. For 3 days, the Crusaders turned Jerusalem into their personal torture chamber. They didn't just kill, they innovated in cruelty. Jewish families who had taken refuge in their synagogue were burned alive, the building becoming their crematorium. Muslim women and children who had sought sanctuary in the Al-Aqsa Mosque were slaughtered so enthusiastically that Crusader chronicles boast about knights wading through blood up to their ankles. They weren't exaggerating. Archaeological evidence confirms that the Temple Mount was literally soaked in blood. Raymond of Aguilers, a Crusader chronicler, wrote with pride, "Men rode in blood up to their knees in bridle reins." Indeed, it was a just and splendid judgment of God that this place should be filled with the blood of the unbelievers. This wasn't war, it was ritualized mass murder performed as worship. The economic motive behind the religious mask becomes crystal clear when you follow the money. Within days of the massacre, the Crusaders were melting down gold and silver stripped from corpses, weighing precious stones pried from the fingers of dead children. They had found their business model. Kill in God's name, keep the profits for yourself. The church got its geopolitical victory, the nobles got their new kingdoms, and the merchants got their trade routes. Everyone won except the people who lived there. But here's what really should chill you to the bone. This wasn't an aberration. This was the template. For the next 2 centuries, this pattern would repeat across the Mediterranean world. The Second Crusade would bring systematic rape and slavery to Anatolia. The Third Crusade would turn the siege of Acre into a festival of execution. The Fourth Crusade would culminate in the sack of Constantinople, where crusaders raped nuns and used the altar of Hagia Sophia as a drinking table. Each crusade became more cynical than the last. By the time Frederick II negotiated the return of Jerusalem through diplomacy in 1229, he was excommunicated for it. The church had realized that peace was bad for business. War kept the donations flowing, kept the nobles distracted, and kept the common people focused on external enemies instead of internal problems. The Children's Crusade of 1212 represents the absolute nadir of this exploitation. Thousands of children, some as young as 7, were convinced by adult manipulators that their innocence would succeed where armed knights had failed. These children never reached the Holy Land. They were sold into slavery, died of disease, or drowned in shipwrecks. The few who survived and returned home found their families had given them up for dead. But the merchants who organized this horror show made fortunes selling children to slave markets across North Africa. Every time you hear someone talk about the clash of civilizations between Christianity and Islam, remember this. The Crusades weren't about civilization. They were about money, power, and the discovery that religious hatred could be weaponized for profit. The techniques pioneered during the Crusades, propaganda that dehumanizes the enemy, economic incentives for violence, the fusion of religious and political authority, didn't die in the Middle Ages. They evolved. When Spanish conquistadors slaughtered their way through the Americas, they called it spreading Christianity. When European colonizers carved up Africa, they called it a civilizing mission. When modern extremists fly planes into buildings or bomb mosques, they're using the same playbook. Convince people that murder is holy, and they'll commit atrocities that would otherwise be unthinkable. The Crusades taught humanity a lesson we've never forgotten. Wrap your worst impulses in the flag of righteousness, and people will not only forgive your crimes, they'll celebrate them. The knights who massacred Jerusalem weren't monsters. They were ordinary people who had been convinced that extraordinary evil was actually extraordinary good. But this story, it didn't end in 1291 when Acre fell. The next time you see religious violence on the news, remember Urban II's recruitment speech? The next time you hear someone justify atrocity in the name of a higher cause, remember the children who burned alive in Jerusalem's synagogues. And notice how little we've really changed, if we've changed at all. You want to understand how ordinary farmers became genocidal maniacs? How devout Christians learned to torture children in God's name? The Crusades weren't just military campaigns. They were the world's first systematic experiment in mass psychological conditioning. And the techniques they developed are still being used today, refined by governments and extremist groups who studied their methods with academic precision. The transformation didn't happen overnight. It took months of careful psychological manipulation to turn a peasant who wouldn't hurt a fly into a knight who would skin a Muslim child alive for entertainment. The church had discovered something that modern cult deprogrammers know all too well. Given the right conditions, anyone can become a monster. Anyone, even you. The process started with isolation. Once you took the Crusader's oath, you were spiritually separated from everyone who hadn't. Your old life, your old relationships, your old moral framework, all of it became irrelevant. You were now part of God's chosen army, and God's chosen army played by different rules. The psychological term for this is moral disengagement, and it's the first step in creating killers. Brother Guibert of Nogent, writing his chronicles in 1108, documented the transformation with clinical precision. Men who yesterday wept at the thought of killing a chicken now laugh as they split open human skulls. But he didn't understand what he was witnessing. The systematic destruction of empathy through religious conditioning. The church had weaponized confession. Normally, confession was about acknowledging sin and seeking forgiveness. But Crusaders were told that their violence wasn't sin. It was sacrament. Every Muslim they killed was a prayer. Every church they looted was an offering. Every woman they raped was God's will being done. The moral framework that kept civilization functioning was inverted overnight. They created ritual around murder. Before battle, Crusaders would spend hours in prayer, fasting, and self-flagellation. They would march into combat singing hymns, their weapons blessed by priests. This wasn't just spiritual preparation, it was psychological conditioning that transformed killing from sin into worship. Modern military psychologists use similar techniques to overcome soldiers' natural reluctance to kill, but they've never achieved the Crusaders' level of systematic brutality. The dehumanization process was methodical. Muslims weren't called Muslims, they were infidels, dogs, demons in human form. Jews weren't people, they were Christ killers, spawn of Satan, poisoners of wells. Eastern Christians weren't fellow believers. They were schismatics, heretics, false believers. Language was weaponized to make mass murder not just acceptable, but necessary. But here's where it gets truly disturbing. They didn't just dehumanize their enemies, they dehumanized themselves. Crusader chronicles are filled with knights describing themselves as instruments of God's wrath, vessels of divine justice, swords in the hand of Christ. They had psychologically removed their own agency, their own moral responsibility. They weren't choosing to commit atrocities. God was choosing through them. The siege tactics reveal the depth of this psychological transformation. At the Siege of Ma'ara in 1098, the Crusaders didn't just resort to cannibalism out of desperation. They ritualized it. They cooked Muslim corpses in front of the city walls, making sure defenders could see and smell what awaited them. Children were boiled alive in cauldrons. Women were roasted on spits like animals. This wasn't military strategy. It was psychological warfare designed to break the human spirit through sheer horror. Radulf of Caen recorded the scene with disturbing enthusiasm. Our men boiled pagan adults in cooking pots. They impaled children on spits and devoured them grilled. But notice his language. These weren't human beings being murdered and consumed. They were pagans being processed. The psychological conditioning had worked so completely that chroniclers could describe industrial-scale cannibalism without a trace of moral discomfort. The torture methods developed during the Crusades read like a manual for sadists. They would flay prisoners alive, keeping them conscious for as long as possible. They would force parents to watch their children being dismembered. They would rape women in front of their husbands, then force the husbands to choose which family member died next. These weren't isolated incidents committed by rogue soldiers. They were systematic tactics approved by military leaders and blessed by priests. But the real genius of Crusader psychology was how they handled guilt. When knights returned home after committing unspeakable atrocities, they weren't treated as war criminals. They were celebrated as heroes. Churches competed to house their relics. Noble families paid fortunes to marry their daughters to these holy warriors. The psychological feedback loop was complete. Commit atrocities, receive rewards. The economic incentives were carefully calibrated to maximize violence. Crusaders weren't just allowed to keep whatever they could steal. They were encouraged to see looting as divine appointment. God had chosen them to redistribute wealth from infidels to believers. Every gold coin torn from a corpse was proof of divine favor. Every slave captured was a soul saved from damnation. The sex trafficking operation was particularly sophisticated. Crusader armies became mobile slave markets, with knights specializing in capturing and breaking women and children for sale across Europe. The church took its cut, of course. God's work required funding. Young girls were priced according to age, appearance, and virginity status. Boys were evaluated for their potential as servants, entertainers, or worse. But the psychological conditioning went beyond individual transformation. It created what modern sociologists call diffusion of responsibility. In a Crusader army, no single person was responsible for atrocities because everyone was following orders, God's orders, filtered through the church hierarchy. When thousands of people participate in genocide, each individual can convince themselves they're just a small part of something larger, something holy. The peer pressure mechanisms were brilliant. Knights who showed mercy were branded as cowards, heretics, or secret Muslim sympathizers. Those who committed the most creative atrocities were celebrated in camp songs and chroniclers' accounts. The social dynamic rewarded escalating brutality while punishing compassion. Modern gang initiation rituals use identical psychological techniques. The breaking point came at different times for different people. Some cracked during their first massacre, running screaming into the desert to die of thirst rather than participate in more killing. Others maintained their psychological conditioning for years, returning home to rape and murder their own neighbors in God's name. The lucky ones died in battle before the conditioning could wear off, and they had to confront what they had become. The children who witnessed these atrocities were perhaps the most damaged victims. They watched their parents being tortured to death, their siblings being sold into slavery, their entire world being destroyed by men who claimed to serve a God of love. Many developed what we would now recognize as severe PTSD, but in the medieval world, trauma responses were interpreted as demonic possession. The victims were blamed for their own psychological wounds. The Crusaders discovered that violence is addictive. Knights who returned home after the First Crusade found civilian life unbearably boring. They had tasted ultimate power, the power to decide who lived and who died, who suffered and who prospered. Normal life, with its rules and consequences and moral boundaries, felt like prison. Many joined subsequent crusades not out of religious conviction, but because they had become psychologically dependent on sanctified violence. The technology of terror evolved with each campaign. The Second Crusade introduced systematic rape as a weapon of war. The Third Crusade perfected psychological torture techniques that would make CIA interrogators jealous. The Fourth Crusade demonstrated that Crusader violence could be turned against any target, regardless of religion or nationality. Each iteration became more efficient, more brutal, more psychologically sophisticated. But perhaps the most disturbing aspect of Crusader psychology was how it spread beyond the armies themselves. Civilian populations in Crusader territories learned to see violence as normal, even necessary. Children grew up in societies where torture was entertainment, where slavery was commerce, where genocide was policy. The psychological conditioning infected entire cultures, creating generations of people who saw brutality as natural law. The bureaucracy of atrocity was equally sophisticated. The Crusader states developed administrative systems for managing slave populations, processing loot, and documenting atrocities for tax purposes. They created legal frameworks that made genocide profitable and torture efficient. What emerged wasn't just military conquest. It was the industrialization of human suffering. When modern extremists study the Crusades, they're not looking at military tactics or religious inspiration. They're studying the psychology. How do you turn ordinary people into killers? How do you sustain brutality over decades? How do you create social systems that reward atrocity? The Crusades answered all these questions with terrifying precision, but this psychological warfare didn't end when the last Crusader stronghold fell. The techniques spread across Europe, refined and adapted for new purposes. The Spanish Inquisition, the witch hunts, the colonial genocides, all of them used psychological conditioning methods pioneered during the Crusades. The template for sanctified violence had been perfected, and humanity has been using it ever since. You think human trafficking is a modern problem? Think again. The Crusades created the most sophisticated sex trade network the medieval world had ever seen, and they did it all in God's name. What I'm about to tell you will make your skin crawl because it reveals how easily religious authority can be used to justify the most depraved crimes against humanity. And the worst part? The systems they created never really disappeared. They just evolved. The moment the first Crusader army crossed into Anatolia in 1097, they weren't just conquering territory, they were harvesting human flesh for profit. Women and children weren't casualties of war. They were the primary commodity. The Crusades weren't just military campaigns. They were the world's first industrialized human trafficking operation, complete with supply chains, distribution networks, and quality control standards that would impress modern organized crime syndicates. Brother Albert of Aachen documented the process with bureaucratic precision, though he didn't understand the horror he was recording. Young maidens were sorted by age and comeliness, with the finest reserved for noble houses, and the remainder distributed among the common soldiers. He was describing a slave auction, but in his mind, it was divine providence providing rewards for holy warriors. The church didn't just tolerate this trade, it regulated it. Bishops established official rates for different categories of human merchandise. A virgin girl under 12 commanded premium prices. Pregnant women were valued for their 2-for-1 potential. Boys were graded according to their suitability for different forms of exploitation. The church took its standard 10% cut, of course. God's work required funding, and human misery was apparently a renewable resource. The logistics were horrifyingly efficient. Crusader armies traveled with professional slave dealers who had developed techniques for processing captives that modern traffickers still use. Children were separated from parents immediately to prevent bonding and resistance. Women were systematically raped to break their psychological resistance and establish dominance. The elderly and disabled were killed on sight. They had no market value and consumed resources. The training methods developed for captured women read like a manual written in hell. They would be stripped naked and chained in groups, forced to watch as resistors were tortured to death. They were starved until they became compliant, then fed only when they performed sexual acts on their captors. The psychological conditioning was designed to destroy their sense of self, turning human beings into obedient merchandise. But the truly sickening aspect was how they justified it. The church declared that enslaving infidel women was actually saving their souls. By forcing them into Christian households, they were being given the opportunity for salvation. Rape wasn't violence, it was conversion therapy. The traffickers weren't criminals. They were missionaries with a unique approach to evangelism. The demand back in Europe was insatiable. Noble families competed to own exotic slaves from the Holy Land. Muslim women were prized for their supposed knowledge of Eastern pleasures. Jewish women were valued for their alleged financial skills. They could be forced to manage household accounts while providing sexual services. Christian women from Orthodox regions were considered premium merchandise because they looked European but had been corrupted by Eastern theology. The pricing structure reveals the systematic dehumanization. A document from the archives of Genoa, dated 1101, lists Holy Land merchandise with the same clinical detail used for livestock. Girls aged 8 to 12 commanded the highest prices due to their trainability. Women aged 13 to 20 were valued for their productivity potential. Anyone over 25 was considered damaged goods unless they possessed special skills. The transportation networks were brutal beyond imagination. Captives were chained in shipholds designed for maximum capacity, not human survival. Death rates during transport averaged 30 to 40%, but this was factored into the business model. The survivors commanded higher prices due to proven durability. Bodies were thrown overboard daily, creating floating graveyards across the Mediterranean that attracted sharks for decades. The breaking process didn't end with capture and transport. Upon arrival in European markets, slaves underwent seasoning, a systematic program of physical and psychological abuse designed to eliminate any remaining traces of resistance. They were given Christian names to erase their identities, taught basic Latin to communicate with owners, and conditioned to respond instantly to commands. Those who couldn't be broken were sold to brothels or killed as examples to others. The scale of this operation was staggering. Conservative estimates suggest that over 200,000 women and children were trafficked during the First Crusade alone. By the end of the crusading period, the number reaches into the millions. Entire bloodlines were wiped out not through murder, but through systematic sexual exploitation that prevented reproduction within their own communities. The quality control standards were particularly disturbing. Professional inspectors would examine slaves like livestock, checking teeth, examining genitals, testing psychological responsiveness. Slaves who showed signs of disease or psychological breakdown were marked for disposal. The church maintained detailed records of these inspections, not for moral oversight, but for tax purposes. The customers weren't just individual nobles. Monasteries and convents regularly purchased slaves for domestic service, though the actual uses were far more sinister. Church records from this period are filled with references to penitent women and converted maidens, who were clearly sex slaves dressed up in religious language. The hypocrisy was so blatant that even some medieval chroniclers couldn't ignore it. The breeding programs represent the absolute nadir of crusader depravity. High-value female slaves were forcibly impregnated to produce the next generation of merchandise. Children born into slavery were considered property from birth, with no legal rights or protection. Mixed-race children were particularly valuable because they could pass as either Christian or Muslim, depending on market demand. The psychological impact on the slaves themselves was devastating. Many developed what we would now recognize as Stockholm Syndrome, becoming emotionally attached to their captors as a survival mechanism. Others retreated into catatonic states, their minds simply shutting down to avoid processing the horror of their situation. The few who maintained their sanity often did so by planning elaborate revenge fantasies that would never come to fruition. But perhaps the most disturbing aspect was how normalized it became. European households that owned Holy Land slaves treated human trafficking as a legitimate business investment. Children grew up in homes where slavery was normal, where rape was acceptable, where human beings were property to be bought and sold. The psychological conditioning that created crusader killers also created generations of Europeans who saw human trafficking as morally acceptable. The geographic scope expanded with each crusade. The Second Crusade opened new supply routes through the Balkans and Hungary. The Third Crusade established permanent trafficking networks connecting the Eastern Mediterranean to Western European markets. The Fourth Crusade proved that crusaders would traffic fellow Christians just as enthusiastically as they trafficked Muslims and Jews. The technological innovations were equally horrifying. Crusader shipbuilders developed specialized vessels for human cargo, with holding areas designed to maximize capacity while minimizing the risk of successful rebellion. They created restraint systems that prevented suicide while allowing access for rape. They even developed early forms of psychological conditioning that used religious imagery to break resistance. The legal frameworks created to support this trade had lasting impact. Laws established during the crusading period gave slave owners nearly unlimited power over their human property. These legal precedents influenced European slave codes for centuries, providing the foundation for later colonial slavery systems in Africa and the Americas. The Church's complicity went beyond mere tolerance. High-ranking clergy owned personal slaves, participated in trafficking operations, and invested church funds in the slave trade. Pope Innocent III himself owned a harem of converted Muslim women, though church records euphemistically describe them as domestic staff under spiritual guidance. The resistance networks that developed were equally sophisticated. Some slaves managed to maintain communication systems, passing information about escape routes and sympathetic helpers. A few succeeded in returning to their homelands, bringing first-hand accounts of European brutality that hardened Muslim resistance to future crusades. The long-term genetic impact is still visible today. DNA analysis has revealed European genetic markers spread across the Middle East and North Africa, testament to the systematic rape campaigns conducted during the Crusades. These genetic traces represent not cultural exchange, but mass sexual violence preserved in the human genome. The economic impact was equally profound. The wealth generated by human trafficking funded the construction of cathedrals, supported monastic communities, and financed future military campaigns. The Gothic architectural revolution was literally built on the profits of human misery, though art historians rarely mention this uncomfortable truth. The psychological techniques developed for managing slaves influenced European attitudes toward women, servants, and social inferiors for centuries. The power dynamics established during the Crusades created templates for exploitation that extended far beyond the slave trade itself, shaping European society in ways that persist today. But this machinery of human exploitation didn't disappear when the Crusader states fell. The networks, the techniques, the legal frameworks, the social attitudes, all of it was absorbed into European society and adapted for new purposes. The Spanish conquest of the Americas, the African slave trade, the colonial exploitation of Asia, all of them used methods and justifications pioneered during the Crusades. And here's what should terrify you most. These systems never really ended. They just became more sophisticated, more hidden, more efficient. The next time you hear statistics about modern human trafficking, remember that you're looking at the latest evolution of techniques perfected by holy warriors nearly 1,000 years ago. You want to understand why the Crusades lasted for centuries? Follow the money. What I'm about to reveal will change how you see every cathedral, every monastery, every piece of medieval religious art you've ever admired. Because behind all that sacred beauty lies the most sophisticated financial fraud in human history. a con game so brilliant that modern Wall Street criminals still study its methods. The church didn't just fund the Crusades, it invented entirely new forms of financial crime to make them profitable. We're talking about history's first international banking cartel, complete with money laundering, securities fraud, and Ponzi schemes that would make Bernie Madoff weep with envy. And they did it all while convincing people they were serving God. It started with the invention of spiritual currency, the idea that salvation could be bought and sold like any other commodity. Pope Urban II didn't just promise forgiveness for Crusaders' sins. He created a market for divine grace. Take the cross, and all your debts, financial and spiritual, are wiped clean. But here's the genius part. The church kept collecting those debts anyway, from the families left behind. The indulgence system was pure financial innovation disguised as theology. The church claimed to possess a treasury of merit, a cosmic bank account filled with the surplus good deeds of saints and martyrs. For the right price, they would transfer some of that spiritual credit to your account. It was the world's first derivatives market, trading in intangible assets that existed only on paper. But the real money wasn't in individual indulgences. It was in wholesale salvation. Entire cities would purchase group indulgences to fund crusading armies. The church would send professional fundraisers with portable altars, holy relics, and carefully crafted emotional presentations. They weren't priests. They were medieval venture capitalists, selling shares in a celestial pyramid scheme. The accounting methods were deliberately opaque. Church records from this period are masterpieces of creative bookkeeping that would impress Enron executives. Money donated for the liberation of the Holy Land would mysteriously appear in Vatican construction projects. Funds raised to feed starving pilgrims ended up purchasing luxury estates for bishops. The paper trail was so convoluted that even the church's own auditors couldn't follow it. The Templars perfected the art of religious banking fraud. They weren't warrior monks. They were medieval Goldman Sachs with better PR. Their network of preceptories across Europe functioned as the world's first international banking system. But it was built on systematic embezzlement and currency manipulation that destabilized entire economy. Here's how their con worked. A nobleman would deposit gold with the Templars in Paris and receive a letter of credit to cash in Jerusalem. Simple enough. But the Templars were manipulating exchange rates at both ends, skimming percentages that added up to fortunes. They were also lending the same gold to multiple customers simultaneously, creating liquidity crises when too many people tried to withdraw at once. The Templars' bankruptcy proceedings in 1307 revealed the scope of their fraud. They had been operating as a fractional reserve bank centuries before the concept was legally recognized, lending out far more money than they actually possessed. When King Philip the Sore of France seized their assets, he discovered that their legendary wealth was mostly fictional, elaborate accounting tricks designed to hide massive insolvency. But the Templars were small-time compared to the church's overall financial operation. The papal treasury was running what economists would now recognize as a classic Ponzi scheme, using money from new crusades to pay the debts accumulated from previous ones. Each new holy war had to be bigger and more profitable than the last, or the entire system would collapse. The taxation methods were equally fraudulent. The church invented the Saladin tithe, supposedly a temporary tax to fund the Third Crusade. Temporary, of course, meant permanent. The tax collectors were given quotas and commission structures that incentivized them to extract maximum wealth from Christian communities. They operated like medieval loan sharks, using threats of excommunication and damnation to collect debts. The currency manipulation schemes were particularly sophisticated. Crusading armies needed to convert European silver into Eastern gold, and the church controlled the exchange rates. They would deliberately destabilize currency markets to maximize their profits, causing inflation and economic hardship across Europe. Entire kingdoms went bankrupt funding crusades that existed primarily to generate church revenue. The insurance fraud was endemic. Merchants would take crusader vows not out of religious conviction, but to claim bankruptcy protection. The church's promise to protect crusaders' property meant that debtors could default on their obligations, while their assets were held in ecclesiastical trust. It was medieval chapter 11 with divine authority. The relic trade was pure fraud from top to bottom. The church claimed to possess enough pieces of the true cross to build Noah's Ark, enough of Christ's blood to fill a swimming pool, and enough bones of various saints to populate a small cemetery. These holy artifacts were mass-produced in monastery workshops and sold to gullible pilgrims for astronomical prices. Professional relic forgers operated sophisticated manufacturing operations. They had specialists in aging techniques, authentication methods, and packaging designed to enhance perceived value. A piece of worthless wood could become a fragment of Christ's manger with the right paperwork and presentation. The markup was typically 10,000% or more. The church's quality control for relics was deliberately minimal. Multiple churches claimed to possess the same saint's skull, the same martyr's arm, the same apostle's staff. Instead of investigating these impossibilities, the church simply authenticated whatever would generate the most revenue. Truth was less profitable than faith. The pilgrimage industry was built on systematic fraud. Churches would fabricate miracle stories to attract pilgrims, complete with fake witnesses and manufactured evidence. They would coordinate their marketing campaigns to create pilgrimage circuits that maximized revenue extraction. The Camino de Santiago wasn't a spiritual journey. It was a medieval theme park designed to separate tourists from their money. The medical fraud was particularly cruel. Churches claimed their relics could cure everything from blindness to plague. Desperate people would spend their life savings traveling to these supposed miracle sites, only to find that divine healing required additional fees for special masses, blessed oils, and premium prayer services. The terminally ill were especially profitable targets. The protection racket operated on an international scale. The church would promise divine protection for merchant caravans, shipping ventures, and trading expeditions. For a fee, naturally. When protected ventures failed anyway, the church would claim the disasters were punishment for insufficient faith or inadequate payment. It was a no-lose proposition. The money laundering operations were brilliantly designed. Stolen goods from crusading expeditions would be donated to monasteries, which would then sell them back into legitimate markets. The church provided a divine cleaning service for blood money, taking its cut while providing plausible deniability for war criminals. The investment schemes targeted wealthy widows and aging nobles with promises of heavenly rewards. The church would convince them to sign over their estates in exchange for guaranteed salvation and premium seating in paradise. These pious donations transferred enormous wealth from secular hands to ecclesiastical control, concentrating power in ways that shaped European politics for centuries. The bankruptcy protection racket was equally sophisticated. Debtors could take monastic vows to escape their obligations, with the church negotiating favorable settlements that typically involved transferring assets to ecclesiastical control. It was debt restructuring with divine authority, and the church always came out ahead. The accounting practices were designed to obscure rather than illuminate. The church developed parallel record-keeping systems that made it impossible to track how money was actually being spent. Public records showed funds being used for holy purposes, while private accounts revealed massive diversions to personal enrichment and political manipulation. The auditing process was completely corrupt. The church's financial overseers were appointed by the same people whose books they were supposed to examine. Audits were performative exercises designed to create the appearance of oversight while enabling continued fraud. Any auditor who uncovered serious problems would mysteriously be transferred to remote monasteries or suffer unfortunate accidents. The international nature of church finances made fraud investigation nearly impossible. Money stolen in England could be laundered through French monasteries, invested in Italian real estate, and used to fund German military expeditions. The paper trail crossed multiple jurisdictions with different legal systems, making prosecution virtually hopeless. The statistical manipulation was equally fraudulent. The church would inflate the number of pilgrims, exaggerate the success of military campaigns, and fabricate miracle testimonials to attract more investment. Medieval people had no way to fact-check these claims, so the church could create whatever narrative served its financial interests. The compound fraud was breathtaking in its scope. Every aspect of the crusading enterprise was designed to generate maximum revenue through minimum actual service delivery. The church had discovered that religious authority could be used to justify any level of financial abuse, and they exploited this power with ruthless efficiency. But here's what should really disturb you. These techniques didn't disappear when the Crusades ended. They evolved. The methods developed by medieval church financiers became the foundation for modern religious fundraising, political campaign finance, and international banking fraud. The Vatican Bank still operates using principles pioneered during the crusading period. Every time you see a megachurch pastor with a private jet, remember the Templars' fraudulent banking empire. Every time you hear about religious leaders taking vows of poverty while living in mansions, remember the crusading bishops who built palaces with blood money. Every time you encounter a religious organization that won't open its books for inspection, remember that they're using techniques perfected 8 centuries ago. You think Nazi medical experiments were the first time doctors violated the Hippocratic Oath for ideological purposes? The Crusades turned the Eastern Mediterranean into history's first large-scale laboratory for human experimentation, where crusader physicians, monks, and scholars conducted systematic torture disguised as medical research. What they discovered about human anatomy, pain tolerance, and psychological breaking points would make Joseph Mengele look like an amateur. The transformation of medicine from healing to harming didn't happen overnight. It began with a simple theological premise. If God supported the Crusades, then any knowledge gained through crusading activities must be divinely inspired. This logic allowed church-sanctioned physicians to abandon centuries of medical ethics and treat captured infidels as living specimens for anatomical study. Brother Gerard of the Hospital of St. John documented procedures that read like entries from a torturer's manual. But Gerard wasn't writing about interrogation techniques. He was recording legitimate medical research conducted on conscious subjects who couldn't consent and couldn't escape. The screams echoing through his infirmary weren't from patients being treated. They were from human beings being dissected alive for scientific advancement. The initial justification was almost reasonable. Crusader armies suffered enormous casualty rates from wounds and disease. Traditional European medicine, based on ancient Greek texts and theoretical speculation, was proving inadequate for battlefield conditions. The physicians needed practical knowledge about human anatomy, and they had unlimited access to expendable subjects. What began as emergency field surgery quickly evolved into systematic experimentation. Captured Muslims and Jews were subjected to procedures designed not to heal them, but to advance Christian medical knowledge. They would amputate limbs without anesthesia to study blood flow patterns. They would perform trepanation, drilling holes in living skulls to observe brain function. They would vivisect pregnant women to study fetal development. The record-keeping was meticulous. Church archives contained detailed anatomical drawings based on live dissections, surgical notes describing experimental procedures, and theoretical treatises that read like instruction manuals for torture. These weren't rogue physicians operating in secret. This was institutional research funded by the church and sanctioned by military commanders. The pain research was particularly systematic. Crusader physicians discovered that different ethnic and religious groups had varying pain tolerance levels, and they developed standardized testing procedures to quantify suffering. They would apply heated metal to flesh while measuring pulse rates. They would break bones in specific patterns to study healing responses. They would induce controlled infections to observe immune system reactions. The psychological experiments were equally sophisticated. They discovered that threatening family members was more effective than physical torture for extracting information. They learned that alternating periods of kindness and cruelty could break psychological resistance faster than consistent brutality. They developed interrogation techniques that left no physical evidence while causing permanent mental damage. The obstetric experiments represent some of the darkest chapters in medical history. Pregnant captives were subjected to experimental procedures designed to test theories about reproduction and childbirth. They would induce labor prematurely to study fetal development stages. They would perform cesarean sections on conscious women to observe internal anatomy. They would test various substances to see which ones would cause miscarriages or birth defects. The pharmaceutical research was equally disturbing. Crusader physicians had access to exotic substances from across the known world, and they tested them on unwilling subjects with scientific precision. They would administer various poisons to study their effects, carefully documenting symptoms until death occurred. They would test antidotes by poisoning subjects and then attempting to save them. The survival rate was irrelevant. The knowledge gained was considered invaluable. The surgical experimentation pushed the boundaries of human endurance. They would perform operations without anesthesia, not because pain relief was unavailable, but because they wanted to observe how conscious subjects responded to different procedures. They would deliberately botch surgeries to study infection patterns. They would attempt organ transplants between living subjects, knowing that both donor and recipient would likely die. The documentation standards were remarkably advanced for the period. Each experimental subject was assigned a number and tracked through multiple procedures. Physicians would record physical characteristics, religious background, age, gender, and previous medical history. They developed standardized forms for documenting experimental results, creating databases of human suffering that served as reference materials for future research. The theological justification evolved to support increasingly extreme experiments. Church scholars argued that since infidels were destined for damnation anyway, using their bodies to advance Christian medical knowledge was actually a form of divine mercy. Their suffering in this life was meaningless compared to their eternal torment, so maximizing the educational value of their deaths served God's greater purpose. The anatomical studies were conducted with scientific rigor that would be impressive if it weren't so horrifying. They would systematically dissect living subjects, organ by organ, documenting function and structure with unprecedented detail. These weren't the crude dissections of grave-robbed corpses that characterized European medical education. These were systematic explorations of living human anatomy, conducted on conscious subjects who could describe their sensations as they were being cut apart. The comparative anatomy research was equally systematic. Physicians would perform identical procedures on subjects of different ages, genders, and ethnic backgrounds to identify physiological variations. They discovered that children's bones healed faster than adults, that women's reproductive systems varied based on religious practices, and that different populations had varying susceptibilities to specific diseases. The disease research turned captured populations into living laboratories for studying infection and contagion. They would deliberately infect subjects with various diseases to study transmission patterns and symptom progression. They would test different treatment methods on matched groups of subjects, treating some while leaving others as control groups. The mortality rates were documented with scientific precision, but human suffering was treated as irrelevant data. The military medical research was designed to improve battlefield treatment for Crusader forces while gathering intelligence about enemy physiology. They would study how different weapons caused specific types of wounds, testing armor effectiveness by shooting arrows and bolts into living targets. They would develop new surgical techniques for treating battle injuries by practicing on expendable subjects. The chemical warfare research was centuries ahead of its time. Crusader physicians experimented with various toxic substances that could be used to poison water supplies or contaminate enemy food stores. They would test these substances on captive populations, carefully documenting dosage requirements, symptom timelines, and antidote effectiveness. Some of these early chemical weapons were later used in siege warfare with devastating effect. The behavioral modification experiments explored the boundaries of human psychological resilience. They would subject captives to various forms of sensory deprivation, sleep manipulation, and social isolation to study mental breakdown patterns. They discovered techniques for inducing hallucinations, memory loss, and personality changes that wouldn't be rediscovered by modern psychology until the 20th century. The genetic research was primitive but systematic. They noticed that certain physical and mental characteristics appeared to be inherited, and they conducted breeding experiments using captive populations to test their theories. They would force specific individuals to reproduce and study the characteristics of their offspring, treating human beings like laboratory animals in breeding programs. The age-related studies were particularly cruel. They would perform identical experiments on subjects of different ages to study how human physiology changed over time. Children were subjected to procedures designed to understand developmental patterns. Elderly subjects were used to study degenerative processes. The results were documented with scientific precision, but the human cost was considered irrelevant. The cross-cultural medical research revealed physiological differences between populations that had never been systematically studied. They discovered that different ethnic groups had varying susceptibilities to specific diseases, different pain tolerance levels, and distinct anatomical characteristics. This knowledge was later used to develop a more effective torture and interrogation technique. The documentation was so thorough that these experimental records became foundational texts for European medical education. Students at universities across Christendom studied anatomy using illustrations drawn from live dissections of Muslim and Jewish subjects. The advancement of Christian medical knowledge was literally built on the systematic torture of religious minorities. The institutional nature of this research cannot be overstated. This wasn't isolated sadism by individual physicians. It was systematic scientific inquiry funded by the church, endorsed by military leaders, and celebrated by academic institutions. The experimental subjects weren't hidden away in secret laboratories. They were processed through official medical facilities that operated openly within Crusader territories. The long-term impact on medical ethics was profound. The precedent established during the Crusades, that religious or ideological enemies could be used as experimental subjects, influenced European medical practice for centuries. The techniques developed for conducting human experimentation without consent became standard practice in colonial medicine, Inquisition procedures, and eventually Nazi medical research. But perhaps most disturbing is how this knowledge was preserved and transmitted. The medical texts written during the Crusading period, based on systematic human experimentation, remained standard references in European universities well into the Renaissance. Students learning to become physicians were literally studying torture manuals disguised as medical textbooks. The ethical framework that allowed these experiments didn't disappear when the Crusades ended. It evolved. The same logic that justified medical torture of infidels was later applied to heretics, witches, criminals, and eventually entire populations deemed inferior by ruling authorities. The template for medical experimentation without consent had been perfected, and humanity has been using it ever since. Every time you hear about medical experiments conducted on prisoners, remember the Crusader physicians who turned captives into experimental subjects. Every time you learn about doctors violating medical ethics for political purposes, remember that they're following precedents established in the name of holy war nearly 1,000 years ago. You want to know why the world is still burning? Why extremists from every religion seem to be reading from the same playbook of terror? The answer lies buried in the ashes of the Crusades, where humanity first perfected the art of transforming religious faith into industrial-scale hatred. What I'm about to reveal will show you that every suicide bombing, every religious massacre, every act of holy terrorism in the modern world is just an echo of techniques pioneered by Christian knights nearly 1,000 years ago. The Crusades didn't end in 1291 when Acre fell. They evolved. They adapted. They became the DNA of religious violence, replicating themselves across centuries and cultures with viral persistence. The same psychological conditioning that turned medieval peasants into genocidal maniacs is now being used by ISIS recruiters, Hindu nationalists, Buddhist extremists, and yes, Christian terrorists. The technology has improved, but the blueprint remains unchanged. The first and most enduring legacy is the weaponization of martyrdom. Before the Crusades, dying for your faith was considered a tragic necessity. The Crusaders transformed it into an aspirational goal. They created the psychological framework that makes young people strap bombs to their chests and walk into crowded markets. The promise is identical: die killing enemies of the faith, and paradise awaits. The recruitment videos produced by modern terrorist organizations use techniques pioneered by Crusader propagandists. They mix religious imagery with promises of material reward, threats of eternal damnation for non-participation, and carefully crafted emotional manipulation that bypasses rational thought. The medium has changed from stone carvings to social media, but the message remains the same. God wants you to kill, and killing makes you holy. The dehumanization strategies developed during the Crusades have become the standard template for genocide preparation. Medieval chroniclers who described Muslims as dogs and Jews as Christ killers established linguistic patterns that modern extremists follow with mechanical precision. Hutus called Tutsis cockroaches before the Rwandan genocide. Nazis called Jews vermin before the Holocaust. ISIS calls non-believers kuffar before executing them. The vocabulary changes, but the psychology remains identical. The organizational structures created by crusading orders survive in every modern extremist movement. The Knights Templars' cell-based hierarchy, with its combination of secrecy, loyalty oaths, and ritualized violence, became the model for everything from the KKK to Al-Qaeda. The Hospitallers' system of charitable front organizations that funded military operations is now used by Hamas, Hezbollah, and dozens of other groups that mix social services with terrorism. The financing methods, pioneered during the Crusades, read like a how-to guide for modern terrorist fundraising. The Church's network of international donations, money laundering through religious institutions, and exploitation of charitable tax exemptions established patterns that contemporary extremists follow with remarkable fidelity. Every time a religious organization's finances are investigated and found to be funding terrorism, they're using techniques developed by medieval church bureaucrats. The propaganda techniques are equally persistent. Crusader chroniclers who fabricated atrocity stories to justify retaliation created the template for modern hate propaganda. The blood libel accusations against Jews, the claims of Muslim plans for Christian genocide, the manufactured evidence of enemy atrocities, all of these techniques are now standard practice for extremist movements worldwide. The specific accusations change, but the underlying method remains constant. Convince your followers that they face existential threat from religiously defined enemies. The child indoctrination programs developed during the Crusades established patterns that modern extremists follow with scientific precision. Medieval church schools that taught children to see violence as worship, to view religious minorities as less than human, and to aspire to martyrdom created educational models that are now used by madrasas, religious schools, and extremist youth programs across the globe. The sexual exploitation systems created during the Crusades provided blueprints for modern extremist organizations. ISIS's systematic rape campaigns, Boko Haram's sexual slavery operations, and the abuse scandals in religious institutions worldwide all follow patterns established by crusader armies. The justifications have been refined, but the core logic remains. Religious authority can be used to legitimize any form of sexual violence. The torture techniques developed by crusader interrogators have been transmitted through an unbroken chain of knowledge that connects medieval dungeons to modern black sites. The psychological methods used to break prisoners, the combination of physical pain with religious humiliation, the use of sexual degradation as a weapon, all of these techniques were systematized during the Crusades and have been continuously refined by successive generations of religious extremists. The legal frameworks created to justify crusader violence established precedents that modern extremists invoke with scholarly precision. The concept of holy war that overrides normal moral constraints, the idea that religious law supersedes secular authority, the notion that believers have obligations that justify any action. These legal theories developed during the Crusades continue to provide intellectual cover for contemporary terrorism. The urban warfare tactics pioneered during the Crusades established patterns that modern extremists follow with tactical sophistication. The use of civilian shields, the deliberate targeting of religious sites, the psychological impact of public executions, the strategic use of sexual violence to terrorize populations, all of these methods were developed and refined during medieval siege warfare. The international networking capabilities demonstrated by crusading orders provided organizational models for modern global terrorism. The Templars' international banking system, the Hospitallers' multinational military structure, the coordination between different crusading armies, these organizational innovations established templates that groups like Al-Qaeda and ISIS have adapted for contemporary conditions. The media manipulation strategies used by crusader propagandists established techniques that modern extremists have perfected through digital technology. The selective reporting of victories, the exaggeration of enemy atrocities, the creation of heroic narratives around violence, the use of religious symbolism to legitimize political goals, all of these techniques were pioneered by medieval chroniclers and are now standard practice for extremist media operations. The recruitment of foreign fighters during the Crusades created patterns that modern terrorist organizations follow with remarkable consistency. The promises made to European volunteers who joined crusading armies, spiritual rewards, material benefits, adventure, escape from legal troubles, are identical to the promises made by ISIS recruiters targeting Western youth. The demographics are the same, the motivations are the same, even the recruitment methods are the same. The sectarian warfare techniques developed during the Crusades provided blueprints for modern religious conflicts, the systematic elimination of religious minorities, the destruction of competing religious sites, the forced conversion campaigns, the use of theological differences to justify political violence. All of these methods were systematized during the crusading period and continue to fuel religious conflicts worldwide. The psychological conditioning methods used to create Crusader killers have been refined and adapted by every major extremist movement since then. The combination of religious indoctrination, group pressure, ritualized violence, and reward systems that transformed medieval peasants into genocidal warriors is still being used to create suicide bombers, child soldiers, and religious terrorists. The intelligence gathering networks established by crusading orders created organizational models that modern extremist groups have adapted for surveillance and infiltration operations. The combination of religious authority with intelligence gathering, the use of charitable organizations as cover for military activities, the coordination between seemingly independent religious institutions, all of these techniques were pioneered during the Crusades. The economic exploitation systems developed in Crusader territories established patterns that modern extremist organizations follow when they control territory. The taxation of religious minorities, the exploitation of natural resources, the operation of slave markets, the control of trade routes. ISIS's economic model in Iraq and Syria was virtually identical to the economic systems operated by Crusader states 8 centuries earlier. The diplomatic strategies used by crusading leaders to maintain international support establish patterns that modern extremist movements follow when seeking legitimacy. The use of religious language to mask political objectives, the exploitation of interfaith tensions, the strategic alliance building with opportunistic partners. All of these diplomatic techniques were pioneered during the crusading period. But perhaps the most disturbing legacy is how the Crusades established the psychological framework that makes religious violence feel morally justified to ordinary people. The basic logic, that God's will supersedes human law, that religious identity justifies unlimited violence, that martyrdom in holy war guarantees salvation, has been transmitted across centuries and cultures with viral persistence. Every time you see religious violence in the news, you're watching the Crusades replay in modern dress. The weapons have improved, the communications are faster, the scale can be larger, but the underlying psychology remains unchanged. The Crusaders taught humanity that any atrocity can be justified if you convince people that God demands it. The techniques they pioneered for turning religious faith into a homicidal rage have been refined and perfected by successive generations of extremists. The Crusades weren't just historical events. They were research and development projects for religious terrorism that continue to pay dividends 8 centuries later. And here's what should terrify you most. The psychological conditioning that created Crusader killers is still being perfected. Somewhere right now, young people are being taught that murder is prayer, that hatred is love, that destruction is creation. They're learning techniques developed by Christian knights who thought they were saving the world by burning it down. The Crusades never ended. They just learned to use different flags, different books, different languages. But the hatred remains the same. The violence remains the same. The justifications remain the same. The next time you wonder how ordinary people become terrorists, remember that the answer was written in blood across the eastern Mediterranean nearly 1,000 years ago. And remember that those who refuse to learn from history's darkest chapters are doomed to become its latest victim. The Crusades taught humanity that the most dangerous weapon isn't the sword, the bomb, or the poison gas. It's the human capacity to transform love of God into hatred of everyone else. And that weapon is still being deployed, refined, and perfected by people who learned its power from the knights who conquered Jerusalem in the name of peace. The Holy War never ended. It just found new soldiers. The darkness you've witnessed spans nearly 1,000 years, yet its shadow still falls across our world today. These aren't just historical curiosities. They're active blueprints being followed by those who profit from humanity's capacity for sanctified evil. The techniques, the justifications, the psychological conditioning, all of it lives on, adapted for modern purposes, but fundamentally unchanged. The next time you encounter religious extremism, political fanaticism, or systematic dehumanization, remember what you've learned here. The patterns are eternal, the methods are persistent, and the capacity for ordinary people to commit extraordinary evil in the name of extraordinary good remains humanity's most terrifying constant. Sweet dreams.